long did the euphoria last of having the regulations done and signed before you had to turn your focus to the realities of implementing them?
Well, it was a more gradual or transition than you might think, because we were operating under 1974 regulations.
Right.
So we already had IRBs.
Right.
We had to notify the institutions, but most of them welcomed them, partly because of the role of primer. We haven't discussed that much, but at every stage, I must have given 3 or 4 talks at every primer meeting during those years of development of the commission and the drafting. So people from the major institutions had been coming. Primer's attendance went from, I think, around 50 people in 1977 to 200 or 300 by 1980, maybe 400. Joan could fill you in on those statistics. Sure. But virtually every major institution had been following, and I had been reporting on the drafting, again in general terms so I wouldn't publicly violate the Administrative Procedures Act. But it wasn't a big shock to the research community. They had known something of the commission. They were, through primer and other means, they were well aware of Belmont. They knew the kinds of things we were struggling with. And they found most of the changes reasonable and improvements not, so they were not hostile. As a rule. There were obviously a few exceptions, but the research community welcomed this. And so I think in January of that year, we started writing new assurance documents. And maybe a little aside about assurances, where they came from, might help. Before there were any regulations, it was Dr. Stone, I think, back in about 1972 or so, who created the office that had responsibility for protecting subjects. Don Chalkley was the person who was head of that office, and it was an office over in the Division of Research Grants, which now has a new name. I don't know what the new name is. But his office was called DRG. And their job prior to getting into ethics was to negotiate problems that had not been foreseen in grants and contracts. So, for instance, if an investigator got a grant and a lot of equipment, new X-ray machines or the like, and then transferred to a different institution, the question of what happens to that equipment had to be negotiated. Does it stay in the institution or does it move with the investigator? And so his office of 4 people went to universities all around the country and negotiated these issues that fell outside the granting mechanism. And when they reached an accommodation and an understanding, they signed a document. They didn't want to call it a contract because the legal people had said these are not technically contracts, so they called them assurances. And that's where the notion of an assurance negotiated by NIH people or HHS people with the institution. That's where that name came from, and that process developed. So it had been in existence for a long time. So it was just a shift over to include medical research involving human subjects. So that's where that came from. And we had 4 people who spent all their time negotiating assurances. Really? And we had assurances long before the new regulations were in existence. So all they had to do was renegotiate existing assurances, and that was far easier than kind of starting from scratch. Because we already knew the people in the institution who would end up signing them. We had already dealt with them on other issues in most cases. So it wasn't as hard as it sounded to initiate the new rules.